Today's video is brought to you by Cars and Bids, my online enthusiast car auction site that recently sold this, and this, and this, and this, and this. This is the new 2024 Ford Mustang Dark Horse, and it's the ultimate version of the new Mustang. Think of it as a Mustang GT that's bulked up a bit with some extra power and some other important upgrades. Today, I'm going to review the new Dark Horse and show you all of them and all of its quirks and features. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Dark Horse. Starting with an overview of the new Mustang. Fully redesigned for 2024, the base model still has an EcoBoost turbo 4-cylinder, starts around $32,500, and it has 315 horsepower, which is actually a pretty decent number for a base model 4-cylinder Mustang. I got a Lamborghini Countach that has only a little bit more power than that, and it's a V12 Lamborghini. So even the base Mustang has decent power. Next, you step up to the GT, which uses a new version of Ford's Coyote 5-liter V8. That starts around $43,000, and it has 480 horsepower, which is up 30 horsepower from the old Mustang GT. But then, at the top of the lineup, you got this, the Dark Horse, which also uses that 5-liter V8, but it bumps power from 480 horses up to 500. Now that makes the Dark Horse the most powerful non-Shelby Mustang ever, and it starts around $62,000, which again, for the performance level, 0 to 60 in low 4 seconds, quarter mile in the 12s, that's still pretty good value for the money. Now, to upgrade the Dark Horse engine compared to the standard Mustang GT, Ford adds forged connecting rods from the Shelby GT500, so they're stronger. You also have upgraded camshafts and improved engine tuning, which gets you to the 500 horses. And under the hood, you also have this strut tower brace that says Mustang Dark Horse, just in case you were curious about what it is. But the Dark Horse doesn't stop there in terms of performance upgrades over the regular Mustang or the Mustang GT. There's bigger brakes. The Dark Horse has Brembo brakes with 15.5-inch front rotors, which are big on any car, but especially a $62,000 Mustang. The Dark Horse also has MagneRide suspension standard. It's like a magnetic ride control suspension. I've loved that feature on other cars, and I'm curious to try out the Dark Horse and see how it feels here. That MagneRide suspension is optional on the GT, but standard on the Dark Horse. And speaking of the suspension, Ford has tuned the Dark Horses to be stiffer for better handling and track performance, obviously at the expense of ride quality, but better performance. And you have larger anti-roll bars in the Dark Horse, again, for better handling capabilities. The Dark Horse also comes with a torsion limited slip differential, which will also improve its handling at the limit. But anyway, next up, beyond the mechanical upgrades I can't really show you, some exterior ones that I can. A big upgrade to the Dark Horse is the badging. You can see the rear badge is, well, this. It's not the standard Mustang logo. It's completely new. They've never used it before. And it's like, well, a Dark Horse, I guess. It's supposed to be intimidating and imposing and more aggressive than any standard Mustang badging you'd have. Now, one other interesting thing you'll notice when you walk up to the car, this is probably on a lot of new Mustang models, not just the Dark Horse, but when you press unlock, the lights do a dance. The front lights especially, you can see they have this whole sequence where they go on and sweep across and turn orange and then back to white and flash a bunch of times, and it really is quite a dance approaching your Mustang. In back, you also have a dance with the tail lights. They do something. It's not quite as involved or complicated as what you have in the front, but a dance when you approach your Mustang regardless of which way you come from. Anyway, back to the Dark Horse stuff. You also have this distinctive Dark Horse badge on the front fenders. You can see it here, letting everybody know this isn't a standard Mustang or a GT, but a Dark Horse. And when you unlock the doors, the Dark Horse logo projects onto the pavement. So at night, people can be absolutely sure yours isn't just the normal one. Speaking of unlocking the doors though, interestingly, the key to the Dark Horse is unchanged from the standard Mustang. You just get the normal Mustang pony logo, no cool Dark Horse on the key, which frankly is a little bit of a disappointment. But there are many other exterior changes beyond just the badging. A big one is the wing. The Dark Horse simply gets a larger wing than the standard Mustang GT, and it's very easy to see when you're behind the car in any situation the larger Dark Horse wing. Same deal up front, where you have a more aggressive front end design. You have larger, wider openings for air to come into the engine, and you have a more aggressive front splitter, which helps for aero probably, but certainly makes the car look cooler and meaner and more Dark Horsey. And another upgrade to the Dark Horse, the wheel design is different. The Dark Horse gets different wheels compared to the standard GT, unique ones that are only on the Dark Horse, so that's another way you'll be able to tell it apart. And then there's the tires. The Dark Horse comes standard with high-performance Pirelli P0 tires, which is already a pretty good performance tire for grip and handling. But if you get an optional $5,000 handling package, Ford will chip this car with Pirelli Trofeo RS tires, which is almost like a racing tire. It's the same one that comes on the McLaren Senna and various Pagani models from the factory, and it's also on the Dark Horse as part of that $5,000 handling package. Now, if you get that package, it also includes an even larger wing to show off even more compared to regular Mustang GTs, and improved suspension with stiffer springs and larger sway bars in order to make this car more of a handling menace with the handling package. But anyway, next you climb inside the Dark Horse, where you open the door and you're greeted with Dark Horse on the door sill, just a reminder of what you have. More importantly, you're greeted by Recaro seats. The Dark Horse comes standard with these huggy Recaro seats intended to keep you in place, heavily bolstered with an Alcantara center so you're not sliding around on the racetrack. They even have little holes in the headrest so you can put a racing harness through it if you take your Dark Horse to the track. Now, these seats are optional on the standard Mustang GT, but they are standard on the Dark Horse, another Dark Horse upgrade. The other Dark Horse upgrade in here is on the passenger side of the dashboard. You have a little plaque letting you know which Dark Horse is yours. The letter R refers to the model year in the VIN, and then the numbers are your particular serial number of your special Dark Horse. Now, the other major thing you notice when you climb inside any new Mustang is a lot of screens. A ton of space on the dashboard taken up by screens. Makes it feel very modern and cutting edge in here. We'll get to these screens and their functions in a second, but before you go thinking the screens have made this interior too modern and futuristic for a Mustang, there are some old school touches in here, like the parking brake. Old school handle, none of that electronic button stuff right next to the driver's seat so you can go drift, except that you can't. Even though this looks like an old school parking brake, it's still electronic. So you pull it up and there's no like gradual. When it's up, it's electronically on. And then to turn it off, you push it down. It doesn't really operate like a regular old parking brake. It just looks like one. Now, this car has an automatic transmission. That may not be true for the cars with a manual, but it is true here. You also have an old school automatic transmission lever. Instead of some electronic dial or buttons that you push, an actual lever that you push the top and then go into the various gears, which is certainly, well, old school compared to basically every other automatic car. And it should be pointed out that the Dark Horse is not automatic only. The standard base model EcoBoost Mustang is only available with an automatic, but in the Mustang GT and the Dark Horse, the two V8 models, you can choose between a 6-speed manual or an automatic. Interestingly, it is not the same 6-speed manual transmission shared between these two cars. The Dark Horse gets the upgraded Tremex 6-speed manual, which is borrowed from the old Shelby GT GT350 and the Mustang Mach-1, compared to the standard base model unit in the Mustang GT. The Tremec is said to be better in terms of shifting feel, reliability, and the ability to handle big power. If you modify this car, you're going to want the Dark Horse and its upgraded transmission. But of course, you can also choose the optional automatic transmission, which is obviously what we have here. And if you want to shift gears yourself, you can do that. Go into M mode, and then you have little paddles on the steering wheel where you can upshift and downshift by your desire. But anyway, next we move on to some other quirks in here. How about a button with a Mustang logo on it? It's not immediately obvious what that does, but you push it and it brings up all sorts of configurable Mustang options on the infotainment screen. I'm going to start with the exhaust, which is tremendously loud. This is the sound of the exhaust in normal mode. Take a listen. Okay, so that's normal mode with this exhaust, and get this, there are two separate louder modes. Here's the loudest, which is track mode in this car. Needless to say, that is a tremendously loud exhaust. And I have a suspicion people with stock exhausts in track mode will be getting pulled over and cited for loud exhaust in their factory Mustangs. Fortunately, there is also a quiet mode. You can tap this and go into quiet mode, which sounds like this. Call me increasingly aging, but quiet mode to me sounds pretty good for most normal around town driving situations. But anyway, back to that Mustang tab on the infotainment screen. You got a lot of other cool things to see in here. One, some auxiliary gauges. You can tap here and pull up some extra gauges that obviously update in real time and give you more car info. And there's a second screen that shows even more gauges. You can take a look and see, well, even more car info, which is obviously good to have, especially if you're on the racetrack and you're trying to monitor this stuff. You also have an acceleration timer in here, which you can use to time your 0 to 60 runs, 0 to 100, or drag strip runs, quarter mile, eighth mile. It's all in this acceleration timer built into the car, which is a cool feature for a performance car. You can also use this Mustang screen to configure your individual drive mode. So if you want, for example, really comfortable suspension, but fast, high performance acceleration and shifting, you can do that, and then that's your individually configurable drive mode. You can also change the interior color theme in here. So if you want like the mood lighting to be purple or blue or white, you can pick all of that stuff if that's what you're looking for. And one of the coolest things in this Mustang infotainment display is the ability to configure your gauge cluster display, including there's a digital version of the old analog Fox body Mustang gauges from the 1980s. Look at this. It looks like the old Fox body gauges just brought to the modern era, which is a really cool quirk to add to this car. 80s car nostalgia is starting to come into modern cars. It's been 40 years since some of those Fox bodies were made, and this car is doing a Fox body throwback in the gauges, which is pretty cool. But back to the infotainment screen before I move on to the gauge cluster, I gotta say, this is an excellent infotainment system. It's a large screen that gives you access to everything you need. It's not laggy, very responsive to your touch, and very intuitive. You know exactly where you want to go, which menus you want to go into. A lot of good things to say about this system. I also love the home screen, which displays several items all at once and large enough that they're actually functional and usable to show you, like the radio, the navigation, all displayed there. And I love the fact that when you go into various menus, there's still a little panel on the side that shows, well, something else. You can have your navigation drive route on here, your stereo. It's configurable, but that panel always stays put, so you don't have to go away from your navigation map just because you want to change the radio or whatever. It's really well laid out. But there is one drawback of this infotainment system, and that would be the climate controls. All of the climate controls are integrated into the infotainment system in this car. The only exception is the front windshield defogger, which is a button here in the center. I guess they figure you get in, your windshield's fogged up, you're going to just want to tap something. But everything else is integrated into the screen. Now, the benefit is it's all along the bottom of the screen in this fixed position, so you don't really have to go hunting for anything or go into various menus to try to find stuff, but it is on the screen a little bit less convenient and a little bit less obvious than physical buttons in the center. And by the way, speaking of the climate controls in this infotainment screen, you'll see a control to turn on the heated steering wheel, which this car has, but none for the heated seats because it doesn't have them. Not too often you see a car with a heated steering wheel, but no heated seats. I guess that's the penalty of getting the Recaros. They're not heated or ventilated, but you still do get the wheel. But anyway, next up onto the gauge cluster, which is also a screen and an excellent one, at least from a purely display perspective. Very crisp, shows you everything you need to know, large enough that everything is clear and available to you. No tiny little displays on here. You also can configure what's shown on the center display. If it's trip odometer or various gauges or readouts, you can have it here. My only complaint about this gauge cluster screen is it's just not configurable enough. You can't get it to show you, for example, what music is currently playing or the map showing your navigation destination or where you are, which is disappointing. You'd think that would be pretty obvious. In a digital screen, you can do that stuff, but they haven't in this car, which is kind of a shame. With that said, I do love the ability to configure the display of this screen in various different modes. For instance, there's a sport mode that makes it more aggressive. I especially love track mode, which makes it very aggressive. You can see the tachometer display is especially prioritized here, and it's a totally different look from just the standard gauge cluster, which is a cool benefit of the digital display. You also have a calm mode, which is actually pretty calm. It doesn't overwhelm you with all sorts of stuff and information. It just has the basics in case you just want to do a little cruise and you don't need all that stuff right in your face. Speaking of the steering wheel area, worth pointing out one other interesting thing. You have a steering wheel button on the steering wheel. If you press that, it adjusts the sensitivity of the steering. You can have sportier steering or lighter steering if you don't want it to be quite as precise or twitchy, and that's done just with the simple push of a button. Now, interestingly, one drawback of the steering wheel I noticed is right in the center you have the standard Mustang logo. It seems to me this would have been an obvious place to put the Dark Horse emblem right in the middle of the steering wheel staring you in the face, but unfortunately they decided not to do that, and it cuts down on the specialness of this interior just a little bit, but certainly it does. One nice touch in here is the carbon fiber look trim. You can see it in the center control stack and the center console. It gives this car kind of a sporty flair in here, and you have a little bit more on the steering wheel spokes specifically, this carbon fiber look trim, and over on the passenger side of the dashboard, a little more carbon fiber look flare. Again, it doesn't really do that much, but it does enhance kind of the sporty feel of this interior. And speaking of sportiness, in the back, you got rear seats, and they are very heavily bolstered, just like the Recaros up front. It almost seems like these rear seats are little Recaros for if you want to take the whole family on a track day. Your rear passengers will be snugly in place and they won't be sliding around during hard cornering. As for the overall look and makeup of this interior, I gotta say, it's actually pretty good. Yes, there are some cheap plastics in here and it's pretty dominated by these screens, but generally speaking, this is a decent interior, especially for around 60 grand and for the performance level this car delivers. It's certainly not high quality luxury car in here, but it's a huge improvement over a lot of previous generation Mustangs. They always seem to keep getting better, and this one is the best yet, especially for the money. It's just a pretty good interior in here. And next up, we move back outside the new Mustang, where there are a few more interesting quirks to discuss. Actually, I'm going to start in the trunk, pop it open it up, and you discover, well, nothing too unusual here, although it is fairly large, fairly deep. You do have pretty good trunk space in here. This has always been a practical performance car, relatively speaking anyway, for a coupe with two back seats and a trunk, and that continues here. You also have some extra storage under the trunk floor. Lift it up, and there's storage there because this car doesn't have a spare tire. I'm not sure if that's true of all Mustangs, but certainly the Dark Horse, you get your fix-a-flat and you get a little extra space back. No spare, but some more storage. Now, other interesting things on the outside of this car. One, the fuel door. You pop it open and you can see the capless fuel filler, just like a lot of recent Fords. There's no cap you unscrew. You just stick in the nozzle. Also interesting to point out back here, yes, the rear turn signals still do their sweep across the rear end in the direction the car is turning. That has become a Mustang hallmark for the last almost 15 years now. It's a cool feature and they've kept it on this car. And the front turn signals also do it, but the opposite. In front, the whole thing turns on and then it turns off gradually in sort of a sweeping motion, again, in the direction this car is traveling, which is kind of a cool little touch, front and rear. You also have another cool touch on the back window where you can see previous Mustangs. This little graphic shows the silhouette of previous Mustang models going back to the very original, including the Mustang II. They didn't shy away from the bad parts. They kept it going on this rear window graphic, which is kind of a nice little touch. Most people won't notice it, but if you do, it's cool to see all the old Mustang models. As for the overall design of this car, when I first showed you the new Mustang about a year ago now, I mentioned I was kind of disappointed that they didn't do more with it. They didn't change it more. And frankly, I still feel that way. Looking at this car, it's almost hard to tell it apart from the previous generation Mustang. And frankly, this general design has been used by the Mustang going back all the way to 2005. Now, I suspect the reason they did this is because Ford already rocked the Mustang boat enough by coming out with an electric SUV version, the Mach-E. And they didn't want to go too crazy with the actual tried and true Mustang, considering the controversial Mach-E. So they kept it pretty similar. But in my mind, a little too similar, and it's pretty hard to distinguish the new Mustang from the old one. I just wish it was a little more daring. All right, driving the new Dark Horse. And I gotta tell you, I'm a sucker for a new Mustang. I've said it in a bunch of videos about like the best new cars for your money and the most fun you can have for your dollar and blah, blah, blah. A new Mustang is just a great way to go about having a good time without spending crazy money. You know, this car is 63 grand, but it includes a lot of upgrades over the standard GT. A regular GT you can get for $43,000 base, or obviously, you know, more if you add options. But still, think about it, 50 grand for 480 horsepower. That's just so good. Just a V8 old school muscle car with this sound. And you want to know something? The old Mustang was great and I loved it. This new Mustang is great too. You still get this nice big throaty muscle car V8 and you just get fantastic performance. 0 to 60 in around 4 seconds, which is really fast. So driving around kind of in normal traffic as I am right now, I'm in sport mode, which is a bit harsh. The ride quality, the exhaust note, I mean, it's a little bit much. Even the transmission shifts are kind of harsh, kind of quick, more than you might want in just normal driving, but it's also the fun mode and I'll take it. Now there is a track mode on top of sport that seems like it probably would take things to an even different level of insane based on the sound of the exhaust when you go into track mode, but I don't really have a lot of interest in track mode since I suspect most people won't drive it like that or really on the track. In fact, this particular car is kind of the boring spec Dark Horse. It has an automatic transmission and no handling package, which isn't really how you'd want to have a press car. You'd want to really go for it with a manual and all that, but I think this is how most of these are probably going to be ordered, with an auto and just without the expensive track package. So I think this actually gives us an insight into how people are actually going to drive and use this car. I love that thundering engine note. I just love it. You drop your foot a little bit and it just, it gets so angry with you. It's just perfect for this car. So how does it drive? A little acceleration. Well, here's a jam on the throttle. Man, it's so fast and it just sounds so good doing it. Quick shifting. This automatic transmission is pretty quick and pretty smooth. Usually you got to kind of pick one, but it's a little smoother than it is quick even in sport mode. I think shift could be just tightened up a little bit, but generally speaking it is pretty quick and pretty smooth. It's what you're looking for. The car just also has so much torque, it doesn't have to do that much shifting to really get after it. Steering is more precise than you might think in this car. I've actually had it for a few days and I've been driving it around, and I've been impressed with how precise the steering is in the steering mode. If you press the steering wheel button, it goes into a sport steering mode, and then it can give you a little bit more precision, and it's relatively quick. You still do feel like you're driving around in sort of a big front engine car with sort of a heavy front, a lot of stuff that's up there, but it's pretty good, especially for a Mustang. And the same goes for handling. This car is relatively quick to handle, quick to change direction. Again, not as precise as some of the most precise, like, modern sports cars. Nothing like an exotic car or anything like that, but for this price point, it's pretty good. Certainly a lot quicker to change direction than a Challenger, but it does feel its weight. This car weighs just under 4,000 pounds, and it feels like that. There's a little bit of body roll. It's nice and composed, and it's predictable, but you do feel a little bit of body roll. Still, though, it's a huge improvement over Mustangs of old, and then when you combine that with just the sheer force of power that this car has, just the amount you can just roll on, and this thing is just fast. It's just cool also. It's just a cool car. You know, the new Mustang, slightly edgier design with this cool new Dark Horse mod. It's just cool. Right now, this is like a very cool performance car. And it's got the fun to drive character to back up that coolness. And honestly, it drives like a Mustang, just refined a little bit. It's not the most precise, it's not the quickest to steer, it's not necessarily even the fastest, but it's really good at all those things, especially for a $63,000 price point. Or $50,000 for a well-equipped GT. And so that's the new 2024 Ford Mustang Dark Horse. I still think Ford should have taken more risks with the design of the new Mustang, but when it drives this well and it's this much fun, I guess I can live with the look. Anyway, now it's time to give the Dark Horse a Doug score. And the Doug score is here, 61 out of 100, which beats out the old Mustang GT, but falls a bit short of some key rivals like the new Toyota Supra and the new Nissan Z. Truthfully though, the Dark Horse is extremely competitive with these cars. The differences here are minor, like I think the Z looks better and the Supra is slightly faster. Overall though, I love the Dark Horse for what it is. Old school, high performance American muscle. It's a cool car, I love driving it, and I love that it still exists.